Many times, the workings of history are unforeseeable, even for those writing it, and one event may trigger a whole bunch of unintended consequences across the world. Like Christopher Columbus trying to find a sea passage to India, only to discover a whole new continent. Or Pope Innocent III calling for a crusade against Muslim Egypt, leading to the sack of Christian Constantinople in 1204 instead. And of course, El Salvador handing Honduras its ass in the second qualifier match of the 1970 FIFA World Cup, ending with Salvadoran troops invading Honduras in what must go down as the most unsportsmanlike conduct in the history of sports. The ripple effects of the French Revolution, though, would be as unexpected as far-reaching, leading to the independence of Haiti from France, the independence of the Spanish colonies in South America, the independence of Brazil, and also the Arab Awakening. The Arab Awakening, also known as Arabic Renaissance or Nahda in Arabic, refers to a period from roughly 1860 to 1940. It was triggered by the French attempt to occupy Egypt in 1798, in which Europeans and Arabs faced each other on the battlefield for the first time since the Crusades. However, in contrast to the Crusades, the French military power proved to be far superior and forced the Arab world to ask itself how it could have lost its advantage over Europe and regain a more significant position in the world once again. But why did the French invade Egypt in the first place? See, after the start of the French Revolution, France would find itself in conflict with the British, but lacked the resources to attack Great Britain outright. So instead, France opted for a strategy that would first undermine British influence in the Middle East and later India. French leadership therefore decided to send an expedition to Ottoman Egypt to colonize it. This decision came with the added benefit of removing a popular and overambitious general from the picture. This general was none other than Napoleon Bonaparte. Napoleon just returned from the successful Italian campaign that made him very popular among soldiers and the populace alike. The expedition of 1798 to Egypt and the Levant provided him with an opportunity to step into the footsteps of one of his idols, Alexander the Great. Long story short, the French campaign didn't go exactly according to plan. As of the army of 40,000, 15,000 soldiers died in combat, while as many died of diseases. This was partially because the French knew very little about the conditions they would encounter in Egypt and didn't plan accordingly. After a little over a year, Napoleon would sneak out of Egypt and abandon his troops, returning to France, where he would soon take power in the coup of the 18th Brumaire. Besides finding the Rosetta Stone, Napoleon's expeditions would have far-reaching consequences on Egypt and in fact the whole Middle East. For one thing, he brought 3 printing presses with him, one in French, one in Greek, and one in Arabic. Those 3 printing presses would be Egypt's first and greatly aid the propagation of literature in the following years. Furthermore, Napoleon's victory over the Mamluks at the Battle of the Pyramids in 1798 would also break the latter's dominance over Egypt and create a power vacuum that Muhammad Ali Pasha would fill in 1805. Muhammad Ali was part of a larger Ottoman force from Albania charged with fighting the French army. After the defeat of the French in 1801, he would stay in Egypt, build his power base, and eventually create his own dynasty and challenge Ottoman overlordship. To Muhammad Ali Pasha, like anyone else in Egypt, it was obvious that the French were vastly superior to the Ottomans in technology, organization, and military. He realized that Egypt was in dire need of modernization and embarked on an ambitious reform program to catch up with France and the British. He overhauled land ownership and the military, introduced cotton as a cash crop, and built railways across the country. In his quest of catching up with Europe, he would also send scholars to France, Great Britain, Germany, and Italy. Those scholars would study at European universities and return with new ideas to Egypt. One of them was Rifa at-Tatawi, who is regarded as the pioneering figure of the Arab Awakening. At-Tatawi went to Paris in 1826 to be the imam of the first education mission sent to France. He would stay there until 1831 and study ethics, philosophy, and mathematics. During his time in France, he read the works of French Enlightenment thinkers like Voltaire, Rousseau, and Montesquieu. Upon returning to Egypt, he would be tasked with improving Egypt's infrastructure and education system. In 1835, he would found the School of Languages in Cairo, which exists to this very day. He tried to combine Islamic principles with European social theories, and saw Islam fit to integrate the modern scientific approach, but he was against the adoption of secularism which he experienced in France. One of his most important achievements was his conception of the 5 basic freedoms every Egyptian should have. Those were first, freedom as the natural human state, meaning that slavery was to be outlawed. Second, freedom of behavior. Third, freedom of conscience or belief. Fourth, civil freedom, meaning that people could go out on the streets and protest and discuss their opinions in public. And lastly, political freedom, holding political leaders accountable. And while this concept shows clear influence of the aforementioned French Enlightenment scholars, he adopted a unique Egyptian perspective in his thinking. His support of a parliamentarian system in women's education went against the positions of Egypt's rulers and the Al-Azhar University, and to this day haven't been fully achieved in Egypt, demonstrating just how progressive of a thinker at-Tatawi was. He decided, though, to not challenge the status quo and elites too much, and didn't advocate openly for a parliamentarian system or women's rights. After all, Muhammad Ali Pasha was not interested in the slightest in sharing his power with anyone else, and was also at-Tatawi's most important backer. Muhammad Ali's successor, Abbas I, tried his best to undo the reforms of his predecessor and was widely regarded as a bigot. He exiled at-Tatawi to Khartoum, where he focused on translating. Abbas was murdered by one of his slaves in 1854. The next two rulers of Egypt, Said and Ismail I, would continue Muhammad Ali's reforms, building schools, railways, and irrigation channels. At-Tatawi would work for both rulers, playing a crucial role in the expansion of the education system once again. He would also leave his imprints on the Arabic language. While translating European books, he had to come up with translations for words that had no counterpart in Arabic. Among the words that he introduced to Arabic were the words for civilization, republic, nation, and homeland. Another important figure in the Arab awakening was Boutros al-Bustani, whose achievements in the fields of education and reform and the propagation of the Arabic language earned him the nickname of Master and Father of the Arabic Renaissance. Boutros al-Bustani was a Syrian Christian born in 1819 and started his teaching career in the service of an American Protestant mission in Beirut. His contributions to the Arab awakening came after the religious political crisis in modern Lebanon of 1860. He started publishing a newspaper where he spread his ideas of a Syrian fatherland transcending the sectarian and political divisions witnessed during the modern Lebanon crisis. He looked back at the Islamic Golden Age under Abbasid rule and argued that, like in Europe, a separation of state and religion was necessary to achieve an Arabic Renaissance. He opened secular schools in Syria where he would teach people from all backgrounds and, like at-Tatawi, advocated for the adoption of European political ideas and technology. He compiled numerous books on education, an Arabic dictionary, and an encyclopedia. He was also a supporter of the reformation of the Ottoman Empire and believed in its future. For his idea of Syrian fatherland transcending religion and local affiliations, later generations would regard him as the first Syrian nationalist. Both at-Tatawi, who died in 1873, and al-Bustani, who died in 1883, advocated heavily on learning from European countries, especially France and Britain. But this was probably only because the influence of European powers in the Middle East was still comparatively weak at their times. Scholars from Iran, meanwhile, like Jamal al-Din al-Afghani, or Egyptian scholars after the reign of Ismail I, were more rejective of European values and much more concerned with preserving their local, especially Islamic culture. Yet to thinkers like Afghani, the rejection of European values didn't mean a rejection of technology and science. To him, Islam was in harmony with scientific reason, and indeed the religion demanded by reason. But he rejected ideas such as nationalism, perceiving them as divisive by nature and introduced by foreigners to divide the Ummah, the Islamic community. He believed that to resist further encroachment, especially by the British, that the Ummah would have to unite. He had strong political beliefs and was especially critical of the Shah of Iran, Nasser al-Din. Even though he worked in government institutions many times in his life, he always ended up being expelled out of suspicion of his political views. Those suspicions were well placed, as he was one of the co-conspirators behind the murder of the Shah Nasser al-Din in 1896. Afghani was also exiled multiple times in his life and therefore spent long periods of his life in Iran, Afghanistan, India, Cairo, Constantinople, and also Europe. While in Egypt, Afghani would meet Muhammad Abdu, a young man who would become his disciple and with whom he would publish a number of newspapers criticizing European imperialism. Like Afghani, Abdu would also recognize the importance of rationality to live a life in accordance with Islam. The two met right around the time when the accumulated debts of Ismail I's reform and infrastructure program resulted in his ouster through British pressure on the Ottoman Sultan. While Abdu supported the ensuing Urami rebellion directed against the British, he still defended the rights of the Egyptian Copts and throughout his life advocated for friendship between Muslims, Christians, and Jews. In his advocacy for reason, he would criticize traditional Muslim scholars for being too narrow-minded when it came to reinterpreting Islam in accordance with the demands of modernity and overly relying on interpretations of medieval clerics. In his eyes, Islam encouraged the independence of will and independence of thought, and rejected a mindless imitation of tradition. He believed to have encountered those qualities in Europe, which inspired him to say, "I went to the West and saw Islam, but no Muslims. I got back to the East and saw Muslims, but not Islam." While in exile in Lebanon, Abdul would come into contact with Rashid Rida, who would become his disciple and be regarded as his successor after Abdul's death in 1905. Rida would also meet Afghani shortly before Afghani died in 1897, close to Istanbul. Rida had a more traditionalist agenda though, even rewriting some of Abdul's legacy to portray him in accordance with his own views. He was also an ambassador for stronger pan-Islamic unity and advocated for a return to the doctrines practiced by the Salaf, the first 3 generations of Muslims, making him one of the precursors of modern Salafism. This represented a clear break with Abdul's modernist beliefs and resulted in a split of Abdul's followers into a rationalist camp and a more traditionalist Salafi camp led by Rida. Both groups wanted to rejuvenate Islam, but didn't agree on whether a stronger embrace of rationality or the example of the Salaf would bring about this Islamic revival. Over the years, Rida turned into a strong critic of the Young Turks movement. He accused them of introducing Western concepts into Islam, like nationalism, and trying to Turkify the Ottoman Empire. He wrote that Islam had been undermined by Ottoman rulers, accusing Turks of having usurped the Abbasids of Muhammad's Quraysh clan. While he was not advocating for Arab nationalism and advocated for an Arab state only after the 1916 Arab uprising, he still believed that the Arabs were best suited to lead a pan-Islamic revival. After all, he rejected nationalism just like Afghani did, calling it close to apostasy and saying that a Muslim is a member of a body bigger than his people. His own personal homeland is only a part of his religious homeland. He must therefore seek to make the progress of the part a means towards the progress of the whole. Rida was not alone in condemning Turkish influence on Islam. The Syrian Abd al-Rahman al-Kawakibi was an even more ardent critic of the Turks, stating that Islam would have been better off if the Turks had never embraced the faith. He advocated for a revival of the caliphate through electing a member of the Quraysh clan as caliph. This caliphate would be based in the Hijaz and independent of the Ottomans. But Kawakibi was also not advocating for Arab independence. He was a pan-Islamist and only wanted to purify the religion from Western influences to which the Ottomans succumbed. The first to endorse an independent Arab realm were Christian scholars like the Lebanon-born Naguib Assouri and Ibrahim al-Yassi. Both men, like Rida and Kawakibi, contemned the Turks. But their anger didn't stem from what the Turks allegedly did to Islam, but what they did to the Arabs. Both believed that without the influence of the Turks, the Arabs would be much more civilized, and in the words of al-Yassi, the Arabs were the most remarkable of nations in the world. Assouri even had plans for the territory and character of the state. He believed the state should encompass the Arabian Peninsula, Iraq, and Syria, but not Egypt, because he believed the Egyptians to be of North African descent. The state should be modeled after Britain and France and be a secular, liberal, and constitutional sultanate. Their thoughts didn't find much support among Muslim Arabs though, as at that time most Arabs first and foremost identified with their religion and tribal affiliation, not their ethnicity or language. To them, like Kawakibi and Rida, Arabism was to be subordinated to Islam and unity was to be achieved through religion. This was the state of the Arab awakening at the very beginning of the 20th century. So what is the conclusion of this video? Well, first of all, the Arab awakening has a lot to do with the fact that the Muslim world as a whole realized in the 19th century that it had been surpassed by the European powers. This led many prominent scholars to wonder how Islam could be rejuvenated. At first, Arab intellectuals seem to have been fairly open to European ideas and influences, but this started to change in the second half of the 19th century when it became clear that the European powers, especially France and Britain, also had ambitions over the territories inhabited by Muslims and Arabs. While a group of modernists was looking for ways to combine Islam with the European values they believed were responsible for Europe's sudden ascent, another group believed that foreign influences, speak Turkish and European, were responsible for the weakened state Muslims and Arabs found themselves in during the turn of the centuries. They were therefore seeking to purify Islam of perceived distortions. It is very important to note, though, that the vast majority of Muslim Arab scholars were not really concerned with the state of Arabs, but the state of Islam as a whole. This is probably best summarized by Rashid Rida's demand that the progress of the parts has to be means towards progress of the whole. Most Muslim Arabs still supported the Ottoman Empire because they believed it could be of help in delivering an Islamic revival. Only when the Ottoman Empire tried to reform itself on a model of European powers, and therefore started to embrace liberalism, nationalism, and parliamentarianism, did Muslim Arabs start to reject the empire. The only consequent critics of the Ottoman Empire were the Christian Arabs that were not concerned with an Islamic revival. They put their hopes in a secular nation-state where them being a religious minority would be overshadowed by being a member of the ethnic majority. The Christian Arabs didn't find much support among the Muslim brethren, though. Only when the Ottoman Empire was already unraveling, calls among Muslim Arabs for Arab independence and Arab unity became louder. But that will be the topic of the next video, where I'll be taking a look at the 1916 Arab Revolt and the conception of Arab nationalism by Saty al-Husri. This is my first video on YouTube, so I'm incredibly grateful for everyone who watched until here. I'm planning to make a video about once every week and will focus on the history of Arab nationalism for the first few weeks. I'd be very happy to read your feedback in the comments and get your input on what I can improve on. Thank you very much and have a great day. See you next week.